Good afternoon to our News 6 Plus viewers. My name is Donovan Myrie. I am an investigative reporter here at News 6 WKMG. You were just looking at live pictures from Washington, D.C. of the search effort going on in the Potomac River. PSA Airlines Flight 5342 crashed last night, had a midair collision with a Sikorsky U-60 Army helicopter. Officials believe no one has survived the crash, so it's kind of turned into from a search and rescue into a search and recovery effort. Throughout the day, we're going to talk to a few people regarding aviation safety, aviation investigations. And joining me now is Anthony Brickhouse. He is a U.S.-based aviation safety expert, and we're going to talk a little bit about kind of what's going on in this investigation, or what we think will go on in this investigation as it's going forward. Anthony, good afternoon. Nice to see you, sir.
Good day. Likewise.
We were chatting about a half hour ago before the stream started about what to expect in this investigation. This is a unique investigation because usually in plane crashes we see the NTSB is the lead agency. The FAA is also in there, but they usually let the NTSB take the lead. But there's kind of a third entity that has to deal with this as well today, isn't there?
That's correct. This is a very unique situation. Most accidents, as you mentioned, the NTSB is the lead organization and they are assisted by the FAA. But considering this was a mid-air collision between a commercial aircraft and a military aircraft, the U.S. Army will be investigating as well. So the Army will focus on their side of the accident. The NTSB will focus on the commercial side, and they'll come together and eventually figure out what happened to cause this tragedy.
As we were speaking also before the stream started, it's been a while since we've had a major commercial accident in the United States. We were talking back and forth between two different crashes, one in Buffalo and one in San Francisco. Give me an idea of those crashes.
Well, we had the Colgan crash in Buffalo, and a few years later, we had the unfortunate crash in San Francisco. The crash in Buffalo killed around 50 people, I believe it was, and the crash in San Francisco, Asiana, killed 3 people. So it's been a significant amount of time since we've had what we would consider a major aviation disaster. And unfortunately, as you mentioned, they've shifted from the rescue effort to the recovery effort. So it looks like we're looking at 67 fatalities, which is just heartbreaking.
Yeah. This morning in our morning meeting, as we were talking about different ideas of how we go throughout the day and cover the story, one of the people asked, "Is flying safe?" And I said, "Yes, it's very safe. You're the aviation expert. Is flying safe?"
It's hard to talk about that today, considering what happened last night. But if you look at the numbers, flying is the safest mode of transportation. I literally said to a group yesterday that if you make it to Orlando International Airport, the most risk that you would have experienced was in the car driving to the airport. Once you get to the airport and hop on that aircraft, you are safe. Our system in the U.S. is tremendously safe, even though we do have accidents from time to time. And the way safety works is you have an accident, you investigate it, you find out exactly what happened, you make changes, and hopefully you get better so that the same events don't repeat themselves.
That's a really interesting point because there is the accident investigation and then there are the changes. And those are two different departments because, well, you take us through it. Like, what are the two departments? Who are the investigators? And then who are the kind of agents of change?
Well, the National Transportation Safety Board is mandated by Congress to investigate various transportation accidents. And we're obviously talking about an aviation accident today. So they're going to do their investigation. It will probably take over a year to piece things together. And what they're going to determine is what's called the probable cause, which is the most likely reason why that accident happened. But most importantly, they will make recommendations. That recommendations could be to the FAA, it could be to the airline, it could be to the air traffic controllers, it could be to any entity. And the NTSB does not have any regulatory authority. They can't force anyone to do anything. It will be up to other organizations to accept whatever recommendations the NTSB makes.
Yeah, and sometimes I remember one case a few years back where the NTSB didn't get something right, and it was a case of a United Airlines plane that lost its door on the way to Hawaii, and they initially thought that it was the baggage handler didn't close the door correctly, and through a series of events, they learned that it was a short and the door opened mid-flight and things. So they're not infallible.
No, the NTSB is an outstanding accident investigation organization. I had the opportunity to do a co-op at the NTSB back in 1998 when I was in college and learned quite a bit. But they are humans, and they do, have issues like everyone else. But fortunately, we have systems of checks and balances in place. Even after an NTSB investigation is over, pretty much any private citizen can petition the NTSB to go back and look at an investigation that they've done. So they're not perfect. They do a good job, but we can always follow up and dig a little deeper into any investigation.
Yeah, and I mean, they're pretty much the gold standard for the entire world when it comes to investigations. What are some of the things they're going to be looking into? We talk a lot about black boxes. What are some of the things that they're going to be getting their hands on and looking into to try and figure out what has happened here?
Well, the black boxes, we're talking about the cockpit voice recorder and the flight data recorder. The regional jet, the CRJ, definitely had both of those boxes. I'm not sure what capability the Black Hawk had. If it's a newer model, it probably had some type of capabilities. So you're going to want to get those digital or electronic devices and do a download to learn as much as you can about the operations. The NTSB will be interviewing, and the Army will be interviewing the air traffic controllers who are on duty at the time of this accident and trying to understand what the communications were. They're going to be looking into the operations of both the helicopter and the commercial aircraft to see what information they had and to try to figure out how they ended up at the same place at the same time. You're going to look at the physical evidence. Bent and broken metal actually paints the picture. And when we're investigating mid-air collisions, it's very important to determine the geometry in which the aircraft hit so that we can speak to visibility and things like that.
Right, and I know that there's also a human factor to it as well. That they'll be looking into the goings on of the crews before the collision. Correct?
Absolutely. Something we do as investigators is we go back and we look at what's called a 24 to 72 hour history. And what we're looking at is it anything in the pilot's lives that could have possibly led to distraction or anything like that could have caused to the accident. We're going to look into their training records and try to figure out what level of competency they had. So when you're investigating accidents, you literally do not leave any stone unturned. There's so many facets that you have to look into.
When we talked about the Asiana crash and we talked about the Colgan Air crash, Colgan Air was caused by icing on the wings. Asiana was pilot error as those pilots attempted a landing and came up short on the runway. This is something different as this is a mid-air collision. Mid-air collisions are rare in the United States between a big airliner and just about anybody, correct?
Correct. Typically in the U.S., when we see a mid-air collision, it is in what we call the general aviation world. Small aircraft, unfortunately, do have mid-air collisions occasionally, but it is extremely rare to see a mid-air collision involving commercial aircraft, and it's even more rare to see it between a commercial aircraft and a military aircraft.
Yeah, we had talked about some of the crashes. The first one that you had talked about was back in 1958. United Airlines, military aircraft, TWA, United Airlines over the Grand Canyon. A lot of people out west remember that, and that was in 1956. And then one of the big ones was in, I think it was 1960, over Brooklyn, New York, where you had another TWA plane and another United plane basically come down over Brooklyn and I think parts of Staten Island. And then there was a PSA Airlines or PSA crash midair collision in San Diego with a Cessna. So, though we've had some, we really haven't had many lately. And one of the things you did talk about is that we haven't had them, we've had close calls. And you said something really profound to me before we started this interview.
Well, you're absolutely correct, dating back to the 1950s with the Grand Canyon mid-air collision. That accident literally birthed the FAA that we have today that's investigating this accident. So these accidents are rare, but if you go back and look at the past 2 to 3 years, we have had several really close calls in the airport environment involving aircraft almost hitting each other on the runway. And we've had a few what we would like to call traffic conflicts in the airport environment. So I've been saying for the past 3 years, in my opinion, that the next major commercial disaster was going to be a mid-air collision in the airport environment. And I don't take any pride in saying that, and I'm absolutely heartbroken that it has happened. But when I heard the news last night, as tragic as it was, I wasn't shocked. In safety, when you have something that repeats itself over and over again, we call it a trend. And we've been trending in this direction for 2 to 3 years now. And unfortunately, last night it happened.
And it's not only mid-air collisions. One of the big concerns in aviation are also ground collisions because we have a lot more flights and a lot more things going on at airports.
Correct. Historically speaking, the deadliest aviation disaster happened in Tenerife in the Canary Islands back in the 1970s, where two 747s collided and killed, I believe, 583 people. And hopefully, we will never surpass that number. But we're going to have to get better in every aspect of what we're doing and make improvements to minimize the chances of something like this ever happening again between or more aircraft on the ground or from a mid-air collision perspective, like what we saw last night.
Yeah, that Tenerife crash back in '77. A lot of people don't know that Pan Am plane that crashed was the very first 747 to fly. And when they talk about the history of 747s, your very first aircraft basically was destroyed in that crash. I talked to you about communication between the pilots. A lot of people don't know that commercial airlines kind of operate on one kind of bandwidth of frequency, military operate on another. They both talk to air traffic control, though, correct?
Correct. It's my understanding that in the commercial world, commercial airplanes operate on what's called VHF, and military aircraft sometimes operate on UHF. From what I can tell last night, the military helicopter was speaking to ATC and had specific instructions. The commercial aircraft was speaking to ATC and had specific instructions. We don't know if they were talking to each other, but as long as each aircraft talked to ATC, each aircraft knew what their instructions were. So the question now is, where did the failure occur, and what allowed them to unfortunately collide midair? So as you mentioned a few seconds ago, human factors and the human element will probably play a big role in this investigation.
Getting down to the last questions. Are you familiar with Reagan National Airport? Have you flown into there before?
I'm not a pilot, but as a passenger, I have flown into Reagan National a few times. Yes.
And knowing its reputation, tricky airport, tricky area to kind of fly through?
I'll say that it's a really dynamic airport. You have a lot of traffic. This flight last night, from what I understand, was only added about a year by American Airlines. So it's a very popular airport because of its proximity to Washington, D.C., right across the Potomac. But the D.C. airspace is probably some of the most restricted airspace in the world because of obviously the U.S. Capitol being there. So professional pilots, they know what they're doing when they're flying international. And obviously, the military pilots fly that corridor pretty regularly as well for VIP flights and different operations. So it's going to be really interesting to see what went wrong last night that led to this tragedy.
Yeah, as the investigation unfolds. Anything else you want to add? Because I know you did say something to me when we spoke on the phone before this interview about safety and about investigations. And specifically, you said something so profound about jumping to conclusions.
It's really important, regardless of who we are, from the President of the United States of America to a regular citizen, that we don't jump to conclusion and assign blame without evidence. As air safety investigators, we are trained to keep everything on the table until evidence suggests otherwise. And as of right now, we don't have any indications that anything mentioned in a press conference this afternoon by the president was involved in this accident. So we have to let the professionals in the U.S. Army and also in the civilian world, the NTSB and the FAA, do their jobs and figure out what happened.
And these are people that do their jobs well. Anthony Brickhouse, thank you so much for joining us this afternoon.
My pleasure. Take care.
All right. Thank you, folks, for tuning in. We will be back in about an hour or so. We have another stream coming up where we'll be speaking to a pilot who has flown in and out of Reagan National Airport. So we'll see you at about 2:30 or so, okay? Thanks a lot. Good afternoon.